Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I was the one packing boxes, paying bills, and sending long messages across time zones while I wore the uniform and trusted my family to keep our life steady. And I am the one who opened a phone record after another and felt my stomach fall through the floor because every late night call, every early morning ping, and every little gap where I could not reach my wife lined up with the same familiar number, which belonged to my brother, and in that moment the whole idea of loyalty felt like a joke everyone else had been laughing at before I even entered the room. I kept telling myself there had to be a harmless explanation, because that is what you do when you have built a marriage on shared passwords and quiet routines and the belief that the people who grew up across the hall from you would rather bite off their own tongue than touch what is yours. Yet the more I scrolled, the less harmless it looked. And when I tried to replay our last call where she sounded tired and kind in that practiced way, and he sounded helpful in that smug way, I heard little. Things I had decided not to hear, like how she said she had found the wrench set he left in the garage even though he was not supposed to be in our garage, and how he laughed about the dog learning new tricks even though he does not like dogs and never volunteers to walk one unless he is already at your house. I did the thing service members do when we do not want to believe what we already know, which is to bury the proof under a new task and soldier on, but the proof kept crawling back under the door. And when a friend from back home texted me a photo from a neighborhood barbecue where my wife was leaning just a little too close and my brother was standing just a little too proud and nobody looked surprised about any of it, I stopped pretending that this was gossip or a misunderstanding and admitted that what had been happening quietly while I was gone had finally decided to be loud. The first conversation with my wife felt like talking to a stranger who had memorized my favorite stories for a job interview, because she said she loved me, and she said nothing happened, and she said everyone was misreading things. But when I asked why she had signed for a package at our place during a weekend she was supposed to be with her sister, and why my brother's name showed up on the delivery notes, her voice went flat in that way that says the game is up and the new rules are already posted on the wall, and she told me she had been lonely and he had been there, and they had not meant to hurt me, as if intent could rewrite the part where they chose convenience over the basic decency you owe someone who is you listed as next of kin. I called my parents because that is what daughters do when the ground opens, and I wanted them to be furious and protective and loud on my behalf. Yet my mother went straight to the word mistake, and my father went straight to the word family, and both of them treated my marriage like a test I had failed by leaving to serve. And they asked me to be the bigger person, as if I had not been the bigger person for years every time I packed up our life and kept the lights on and made holidays happen through a laptop screen. And while they talked, I learned something I had not wanted to learn, which is that some people prefer an easy story even when the truth is sitting right there with receipts. I let them talk until they had said every soft thing they could use to cushion their own comfort, and then I did something that did not feel dramatic or vengeful or even particularly brave. It just felt necessary. Because if everybody else was going to pretend this was an accident, then I would be the only adult in the room who treated it like a choice. So I called base legal and asked about separation steps. I started the paperwork that removes a dependent from benefits when there is cause. I changed the direct deposits so my pay hit a new account they could not touch, and I scheduled the locksmith because whatever happened between them was not going to keep happening inside a house I paid for while standing in boots they did not earn. I did not throw anything or broadcast anything because I did not need a show. I needed control, and control looks like the bank sending me a confirmation that the joint credit lines are frozen. It looks like the commissary telling me her dependent card would not work until a formal decision was made. It looks like my brother finding out that the spare key he had pretended to borrow for emergencies now opened a door that no longer existed for him. And it looks like me sitting very still on a chair that has seen me through better and worse and realizing that quiet revenge, the kind that closes valves and shuts off taps, can be the cleanest oxygen you will ever breathe. People think the first hit of revenge is the moment you shout or humiliate, yet the truth is that the first hit is the moment you stop letting other people define what is reasonable. And I felt that hit when she tried to call me from the driveway, and I let it ring because there was nothing left to negotiate. And I felt it again when he sent a long message performing guilt without accountability, and I saved it to a folder named with a word I will not repeat because I do not say it out loud anymore, and I felt it most when my mother called and used the phrase "keep the peace" as if peace were something you can staple over a bleeding wound and not a result that is earned by people who did not stab you. I am not proud of the next part, but I am not sorry either, because I looked back through the months where my wife had said she was cutting back and my brother had said his new business was finally stable. And I found the transfer from our emergency fund that matched the down payment for a place he bragged about, and I found the signatures that explained why the paper trail had been so tidy, and I realized they had not only borrowed my trust, they had leveraged it. So before I slept I filed the fraud alert the bank recommended for contested spousal withdrawals. I sent a formal notice that any debt incurred in my name without my consent would be challenged. And I placed a hold on transactions tied to the card she had been using because confusion looks a lot like theft when you stop being generous. By the time the sun came up, I had not cried and I had not screamed and I had not posted a single word, but the locks were changed, the accounts were safe, the benefits were on pause pending review. And the message sitting at the top of my phone from my father said, "We need to talk," like he was the one with a plan, and I stared at it for a long minute and thought about how many times I had chosen calm so someone else did not have to feel uncomfortable. Then I put the phone face down because I had one more call to make, one that would make sure the thing they had started would not be built with anything that had my name on it, and as the line rang I understood that the part where I let this break me was over, while the part where I showed them how consequences actually work had just begun. The funny thing about betrayal, if funny is even the word for it, is how fast people who swear they love you start negotiating the price of your pain when the person who hurt you is someone they cannot bear to lose. And the morning after I changed the locks and froze the accounts, my mother called with that soft voice she uses for dentist appointments and casseroles to say that mistakes happen and marriages are hard and brothers will be brothers, while my father cleared his throat like a judge, balancing the scales, and told me that I had to remember the stress I had put on the relationship by serving, which was a neat way of saying that my uniform had invited this. And although I kept my voice even and my words measured, I felt something settle inside me, something like a door clicking shut, because once your own parents show you they prefer a simple story over an honest one, you learn that peace is not a shared project. It is a private boundary you defend without apology. My brother tried the apology routine that never names what it is actually apologizing for, which, if you have not heard it, sounds like a toddler doing a press conference. And he sent this long message about missing me and stepping up to help while I was away and getting too close by accident, as if bodies fall into other people's beds the way keys slip into a couch cushion. And he added a line about my wife being scared to be alone that made me want to say that being alone is something you survive by building a spine, not by testing out my husband, but I saved the message to my folder because what he thought was a plea was really a timeline, and timelines are useful when you need to show someone who pretends not to see how long the crime has been going on. I told my parents that the house was mine, the car was mine, and the accounts were now mine again, and that I was not interested in a conversation about forgiveness until the people who wanted it could speak without the word, but attached to every sentence. And they did that parent thing where they remind you of childhood stories and say that you have always been stubborn and strong and sure of yourself, which is their way of telling you to do all the hard work now so they do not have to change anything. And while they worked through their script, I pulled up records and documents and souvenir emails I had never deleted, and I started listing every time the emergency fund was tapped without a real emergency. Every subscription suddenly added when I was out of town, every loan inquiry that should not have been there, because nothing cleans the fog off a situation like a spreadsheet that shows exactly how your trust was spent, like a credit card with no limit. When I say I kept it quiet, I do not mean I went passive, because what I learned serving is that quiet does not mean still, it means strategic. So while they told me to be gracious, and while he asked me to understand the idea of fate, and while she sent a single line that said this is not what it looks like, I called the title company listed on the paperwork for the little bungalow he had been bragging about to my father, and I told the woman on the line that I was filing a formal notice of marital interest because funds had been moved without my consent to support a purchase made by a third party. which in plain language meant that until a judge and the paperwork told me otherwise, nobody was going to borrow against that place or sell it or even fix the porch with a home improvement loan without my signature on it. And the woman, who had heard everything and then some, gave me the steps, and I took them, and with a few filings and a notary stamp, a property my brother wanted to flash on. Social media now had a little cloud hanging over it that he could not see, but every lender would. The neighbors did their usual small-town chorus, where everyone pretends to want only the best for everyone while passing along bright little pieces of gossip wrapped as concern. And one of them forwarded a community group post where my brother said I had gone off the rails and had always been jealous of how close he and my husband were, which made me laugh in a way that did not feel kind, but felt so honest my ribs relaxed. Because if he needed to make me crazy to make himself decent, then we were done with the pretend show where I sat at holiday tables and took a deep breath before every bite, and I decided right then that the next holidays would be hosted somewhere else with different people and different rules, and the guest list would be short and clean, with no one seated next to me who would spend dessert asking if I had tried couples therapy. My lawyer, a woman with a patience I envied and a spine I recognized, explained how to separate the accounts for good, how to close the joint lines I had opened years ago when love still made me soft, and how to log each contact attempt without responding unless it was necessary for the process. And as I listened, I understood that the kindest thing I could do for myself was to stop translating my pain into language my family liked, because they had never offered to translate theirs for me. And by the end of that call, there were new passwords, a new plan, and a fresh understanding that I did not need anyone's permission to end a chapter that had been written without me. The first hit of revenge for this round was blunt and boring and perfect, and it arrived when my brother and my soon-to-be ex tried to refinance that cute bungalow to cover some surprise expenses, which I happened to know because my father left a voicemail that sounded like he was teaching me a lesson about how obstacles happen to everyone. And they discovered that the cloud on the title I had filed meant the lender would not touch the application without my written release, and for the first time since this started, I did not have to deliver a speech or lift a finger or explain a single thing, because the system did the talking, and it said, very clearly, that they could not build their next chapter using money and credit and access that belonged to me. And as for me, I was already drafting a different kind of letter, the kind you send to people who think you can be guilt into cleaning their mess, a letter that would sound polite and final and brutally fair, and although I had not sent it yet, I knew exactly when I would, which is why, when my mother asked me to come to dinner and be civil, I said I would think about it, because what I had planned for that table required an audience and a clock, and I wanted them all in the same room when I made sure they finally understood what consequences feel like. It had been a couple of years since the divorce papers were stamped and the locks had been changed, and I had done the slow, difficult work of making a new life without the weight of other people's choices dragging me into the ground. Yet, even as I built that life brick by brick, my parents seemed determined to act as though the entire disaster had been nothing more than a family disagreement that had spun out of control, something you patch up with a potluck dinner and a group photo, which would have been insulting if it were not also laughable, because the betrayal had been deliberate, extended, and shameless, and no amount of casseroles or speeches about blood being thicker than water was ever going to make it something that could be smoothed over. My mother was the one who started the campaign, calling on Sunday afternoons with that carefully warm tone, asking if I had thought about reaching out, reminding me that my brother and his new wife were struggling with bills, and how nice it would be if we could all sit together at the same table again, and when I stayed silent too long, she would sigh into the phone and say she hated being in the middle, as if the middle was not exactly where she had chosen to stand when she told me to forgive. Before I had even finished explaining what had been done to me, my father joined in by dropping by unannounced, sitting in my kitchen with folded hands and phrases like, "Time heals all wounds," and "Nobody benefits from grudges." And I sat across from him listening to a man who once taught me to return what I borrowed, now teaching me to lend my dignity out as if it were a tool that could be replaced at the hardware store if it came back broken. They wanted me to believe that what I was holding onto was bitterness, when in reality what I was holding onto was the only shred of justice available to me, because when people betray you in ways no law can prosecute, The only sentence you can hand down is distance, and I had handed down that sentence with no parole and no appeal. Yet my parents kept pressing, and the more they pressed, the more I began to understand something crucial. They were not asking for my healing, they were asking for their comfort, because the fracture in the family embarrassed them. And they wanted me to be the patch that covered it so no one else would have to feel awkward during holidays or church services. I decided not to argue anymore, because arguing gives people the illusion that you are negotiating, and I had nothing to negotiate, so instead I let them talk. I let them beg, I let them guilt trip, and every time they did I wrote down their words. I wrote down the dates, I wrote down who called first, who showed up unannounced, who said I should think of the family name, who said I would regret it if I kept shutting doors, and slowly those notes became more than scribbles, they became evidence. Not for court, but for me, a written record proving that no matter how many times they tried to pretend otherwise, I was not the one keeping this wound open. They were, by scraping at it every chance they got. My brother, who had avoided direct contact with me since the fallout, suddenly decided to send me an email with the subject line, "Let's talk," and inside he wrote paragraphs about how much he missed our childhood closeness, how he wished we could rebuild, how hard it was to raise a family without support, and how he thought our parents were suffering because of our rift, as though the rift had appeared out of thin air, as though he had not dug it himself with a shovel labeled betrayal. And when I finished reading, I realized that the email, too, was evidence, because it was never about me, it was about him, about his need for me to pretend that I could forget, about his desire to fix his image, not his actions. That was the moment I knew I was done playing defense, because evidence is useless if you never present it, and although I had no interest in a courtroom, I did have interest in one thing, making sure the next time they cornered me with their pleas for peace, I would use their own words, their own manipulations, their own documents, to show them that peace was not something I destroyed, but something they had signed away the moment they chose comfort over accountability. So I waited, and I let them plan the inevitable dinner. The one where they thought they could corner me into a reconciliation speech. The one where they imagined I would finally bow under the pressure of their disappointment. And when my mother called to say she had set the table and it would mean the world if I came, I agreed without hesitation, because what they thought was a victory was really the stage I had been waiting for, and while they believed they had softened me with appeals to love and family, the truth was that I had never been sharper, because every word they had thrown at me in those years was now a blade I could turn back toward them, and I intended to use each one in a way they would never forget. By the time the invitations to be reasonable and the reminders about family pride became a weekly ritual that felt less like concern and more like a coordinated campaign to fold me back into a shape that fit their comfort, I had already learned how to take pressure and turn it into leverage, which, in practice, looked like me working late with coffee and a legal pad while I mapped out every place where their new life intersected with something I could control without screaming, without breaking laws, and without playing the clown in a circus they kept trying to stage around my boundaries. Because if there is one thing service taught me, it is that a plan executed quietly is louder than any speech delivered in a crowded room where nobody came to actually change. They had assumed that because I did not blast them on the internet and because I stayed civil in public, I was broke, wounded, and stalled, yet the truth was that I had rebuilt in ways they never noticed, because none of my rebuilding required their applause. So while they were posting photos of weekend projects at that little bungalow, and while my parents were hinting about grandbabies and holidays with everyone under one roof again, I was finishing a certification that increased my pay. I was stacking a savings cushion that did not have their fingerprints on it, and I was buying, through a boring county auction nobody pays attention to unless they read the notices, the tax lien on a narrow strip of land that ran along the back of their lot like a zipper. A sliver nobody cared about until somebody needed a clear title for a refinance and an appraiser asked whether the fence extended over the legal boundary and whether a recorded easement existed to cover the mistake my brother had made when he bragged about a new deck he never permitted. It is amazing how quickly bravado turns into logistics when a lender asks for documents you cannot conjure out of thin air, and while I did not deny anything or threaten anyone, I simply did not grant the easement they suddenly needed. which was my right as the lien holder moving toward deed, and when their loan officer politely explained that without a clean boundary and without proof that the deck was permitted, the valuation would suffer and the refinance would stall, I did not gloat, I did not taunt, I did not even text, because watching a machine follow its rules is more satisfying than any argument where someone pretends rules are optional until they need them to be strict, and that was only the first hinge closing. The second hinge clicked when I compiled a packet for the title company that included my earlier notice of marital interest for the funds siphoned from my account during the affair, my formal dispute letters, copies of my brother's emails that attempted to reframe the timeline as a fog of loneliness, and a neat index cross-referencing transaction dates with the days he claimed he had been nowhere near my house, because underwriters do not care about tears or family myths. They care about clarity, and the moment you give them clarity, they become the most honest people in the building. I did not accuse anyone of fraud in wild language, and I did not spin stories. I just laid out the papers and let the math do the talking, which is how I learned that nothing is more devastating to a manipulator than a stack of calm facts with tabs. The third hinge belonged to my parents, who had started suggesting that if I truly wanted to move on, I should consider lending my brother a little bridge money or co-signing a small line of credit because, as my mother put it, family invests in family. And while she said that I was quietly changing every beneficiary designation that still had their names on it, redirecting insurance, retirement, and the house I had since bought in my own name to a trust that would fund scholarships for spouses who kept families afloat while their partners served, because I wanted my legacy to grow in the direction of people who understood duty without bending it into a weapon, and although I did not announce any of that, it made every plea to be generous ring hollow, since generosity already had a home that did not require me to forget my own history. When the refinance died on the branch and the contractor sent them a bill they could not juggle into next season, my father left a careful message suggesting we have a peace dinner, which sounded like a summit, but smelled like a rescue. And I said yes with a kindness I meant, because I was done talking in doorways and on porches and over voicemails that tried to make me feel cruel for refusing to fund the same people who had gambled my life savings on their secret romance. I wanted a table. I wanted faces in the same light, and I wanted to bring the folder I had built for years, the one with tabs for timelines and money and words, the one they would not be able to wave away with nostalgia or guilt. And while I chose a simple dress and finished a day of work nobody would thank me for, I slid that folder into my bag and felt the calm that comes when you know you will not raise your voice, you will not throw a scene, you will not beg for acknowledgement or scrap for crumbs. You will simply show what you know and then decide, on your own terms and in your own voice, what comes next, which is why, when I walked toward that dinner with the people who kept insisting that blood should outrank truth, I was not nervous, and I was not angry, I was ready. Because the last hinge was waiting to close, and the door it controlled led to a room they did not realize I had already emptied of anything they could take. I walked into that so-called peace dinner with a calm that did not come from forgiveness or forgetfulness, but from preparation. Because when you have listened to speeches about unity delivered by people who benefited from your silence, you eventually learn that real peace is a contract with yourself, not a performance for a room, and I set my bag on the chair, smiled at my mother's bright face and my father's practiced dignity, nodded at my brother who would not meet my eyes, and gave a short hello to the man who used to be my husband and who now wore the look of someone rehearsing a justification he hoped would land. Then I sat down and let them go first. Since people who want to manage you will always volunteer to narrate your feelings if you give them a little space to do it. They started with the familiar lines about time passing and wounds closing and how families all over this town have survived worse. And then the more tailored lines about how I had been the strong one since I was little and how I could lead us through this, because I had the backbone for it, which was a flattering way to ask me to carry them across a river they chose to jump into. And while they worked hard to make betrayal sound like a misunderstanding, I watched my mother fold and unfold her napkin and my father measure every phrase like a man selling a policy he would never personally need to use. And I listened as my brother spoke about responsibility in the abstract, as if responsibility were a mist that occasionally settles on a man by accident, and I waited for my ex to say the sentence I knew was coming. The one about loneliness and bad decisions, and the surprising connection no one saw coming, because people who break oaths prefer the story where fate did the pushing. I told them I had listened, and then I said I had brought something so that we could be clear, and when my mother said she hoped it was an open mind, I said it was better, because clarity lasts longer than optimism. And I placed on the table 2 envelopes that had lived in my bag for weeks, the first holding a single sheet that granted a clean and narrow easement across the strip of land I now owned behind their cute project house, along with a brief release that would allow their lender to ignore my earlier notices once it was signed, and attached to that was a second sheet written in the plainest language I could craft, in which my brother and my former husband would acknowledge, in writing and without the usual dodges, what they had done and when they had done it, with an apology that named the actual acts rather than the fog around them, and a promise of no further direct contact after signatures were exchanged, while the second envelope contained copies of the recorded deed. 4. That narrow strip, a letter already stamped for their lender restating my position and the boundary dispute, a summary for code enforcement about the unpermitted deck hanging over property that did not belong to them, and a notice of my intent to deny any temporary access unless compelled by a court, which is a tidy way of saying that their refinance was never going to clear and the backyard project would sit half-finished until they learned to speak plainly or learn to live with consequences. I explained, without raising my voice and without seasoning it with any of the rage they had expected to harvest, that they could choose tonight between 2 futures that did not include me at their table. Because I have a life and a community that do not require me to sit through arguments about whether betrayal counts only if it happens in public, and in the first future they could sign the acknowledgement, pay back the amount that had been siphoned during the affair into an account I had set up for scholarships for spouses who hold families together during deployment, receive the easement for a ceremonial amount of $1, and then honor the boundary that included an end to calls, pop-ins, and group ambushes. While in the second future they could keep their pride and their myths and their stubborn little stories, and I would file the letters already prepared, hold my ground on the boundary, and continue my life without another minute wasted on people who confuse access with love. My father started to protest, and my mother reached for tears she believed could drown paperwork, and my brother launched into a speech about how money should not be part of family conversations when feelings are on the line, which would have been hilarious if it were not pathetic given how many of my dollars had gone missing while my feelings were being traded like store coupons, and my ex tried that soft voice he had used in the beginning to talk me into patience. Yet what none of them seemed to understand is that this was not a negotiation, it was a closing argument followed by a verdict, and I told them that if they wanted mercy they should have brought honesty, if they wanted grace they should have brought accountability, and if they wanted access they should have started by not stealing it. When it became clear that the apology they could offer still had the word but wrapped around it like a ribbon, I slid the first envelope back into my bag and tapped the second with one finger so they could feel the weight of a decision that had already been made. And I stood, thanked my mother for the invitation, told my father that I hoped he meant it when he said he loved me even when I disagreed with him, and then I looked at my brother, who had put a hand on my ex's shoulder like a trophy holder trying to steady a wobbly prize, and I said that I did not hate them, I just no longer recognized them as anything I owed, which is why, when my mother whispered from the end of the table that we could still be a family if I would only try, I shook my head and said the most honest sentence I have ever spoken in their presence, that the family they were selling me on had been foreclosed the day they chose convenience over loyalty and image over truth, that the only family I claim now is the one I am building with people who do not make me explain why dignity is not up for debate, and that as of this moment we are finished, because that family does not exist anymore.